All right, we've got a bunch of questions here. Here's the first one. What's the best compositional advice anyone has ever given to you? Okay, so I actually have two answers for this. One of them I just made a video on. This was not advice that was given to me directly, but it was a quote I heard by a composer named Maurice Ravel. He said, "I begin by considering an effect," which turns out to be really, really useful advice. Go watch that other video where I explain that fully. The second piece of advice that someone actually did give me, this was one of my composition teachers from years ago. She said, "You should always compose in gestures." And it's actually very related to that Ravel quote. It's just, the idea of composing in gestures is just a way of ensuring that you always think about the kind of broad strokes, the big picture ideas first, and then have the details come later. So it's very similar to that Ravel idea, but thinking in gestures means really thinking about where the big moves are, where the ups and the downs, the build-ups and the moments of release and the moments of tension. What are the big ideas that are going on in the piece? And once you kind of map those out, then suddenly all the details just kind of fall into place. If you know kind of what you're trying to do in a broad sense at any moment in a piece, then you just have to kind of make sure all the details support that gesture. It's a very organized approach. So all these different specific musical elements, like the chords you're using at a given moment, the notes in the melody, how those notes interact with the chords, the arrangement supporting that, the dynamics, the type of performance that's being given, the production style, the lyrics, every specific musical element you can think of is going to have an effect on the overall sound, and you want all those different elements to work together. You want them to be unified and kind of support each other and deepen that overarching gesture. So that's been really useful advice for me. I try to keep that in mind basically at all times when I'm writing music. Super helpful. Always compose in gestures. Okay, next question. How do you make a tempo change really smooth? I noticed you do that a lot in Native Construct. So for anyone that doesn't know, Native Construct is a band that I'm in. I play guitar and I write music in that band. So we do a lot of tempo changes. It's a progressive rock metal band. So we do a lot of crazy stuff, like switching up tempos multiple times within a song, and there are a bunch of different ways you can do tempo changes. Some of the main ones are to, one, just do it. So like you're in one tempo and then suddenly you're just in a new tempo with no transition at all. That's going to sound very abrupt, not smooth. Another way of doing it is to gradually increase or decrease the tempo, just speed up over time or slow down over time, and eventually you kind of find yourself at a new destination tempo. So that's really easy to do. That's pretty self-explanatory. Another common way of doing tempo changes, which I think is what you're talking about in this question, is to use a metric modulation. I'll probably make a much more comprehensive video on this, a video dedicated to metric modulation in the future. But for now, the quick answer is that to do a metric modulation, you want to find a mathematical relationship between the original tempo marking and the new tempo marking. So let's go with an example. There's a song called Mute by Native Construct that we did this in. So it starts in quarter note equals 125, and we need to transition to quarter note equals 100. So if you think about 125 versus 100, the ratio there is actually 5 to 4, right? Because if you divide them both by 25, that's the common denominator. 25 goes into 125 5 times, 25 goes into 100 4 times. So you get this 5 to 4 ratio here. So you can exploit that 5 to 4 ratio, and you can represent that in a note value, let's say 16th notes, which is what we happen to do. So in that song, we're in the 125 tempo area, and we started using groups of 5 16th notes. So normally when you think of a pulse, in like 4/4 or whatever, you think of it as being divided into 16th notes with groups of 4. So like 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 da 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 da. So it's 4 16th notes per beat. But if you put another 16th note in there, if you make it 5 16th notes, now you have a slower beat, right? Because you're doing 5 notes instead of 4 per beat. So it's a little bit it's a little bit slower. So if you go from da 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 to well, that's actually a slower tempo, really. but you didn't actually change tempo. You just kind of added another note in the original tempo into that. But then once you have that slower tempo, you can then just go back to dividing that into 4. So now dot, 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 dot. We actually have slower 16th notes now. So you can, there are all sorts of different ways you can kind of bring out that relationship in the music. Metric modulation is a very wide idea. There's lots of room for creativity within that general concept. So that's just one example. Feel free to experiment with that. All right, next question. What software do you use to make your videos? So you're probably talking about my fancy PowerPoint videos. I use 3 different programs for those. First, I do the audio in a digital audio workstation called Reaper. I've used lots of different DAWs over the years. Reaper is by far my favorite, would recommend. And then once I have the audio done, I go into Photoshop to make the visual assets. And then I'll export those and bring that stuff and the audio into Premiere Pro, where I edit everything together and do little animations and stuff. Next question. Why don't you use lowercase Roman numerals for minor chords? Yeah, I've gotten this question countless times. It's kind of a pet peeve of people when they see different analysis styles than what they're used to. Of course, in classical music and the way that you'll probably learn in most music classes, would be to use lowercase Roman numerals for minor chords. That's the classical style. In jazz and more contemporary music, we tend to use all uppercase Roman numerals and then just specify if it's minor by using like a dash, a minus symbol. So that's what I do. There's actually a great video by 12 Tone, who is another music theory YouTuber, which I will link in the description, where he explains the history of Roman numerals, and he explains his reasoning for also using the style that I use, the all capital Roman numerals. So I definitely recommend you go look at that if you have questions on this. But the basic reasoning is that if you think about it, there's actually not much to be gained by using lowercase for minor chords. It's just kind of another thing you need to memorize and learn. It's actually clearer if you just stay consistent across the board and use uppercase for everything, and then just specify exactly what type of chord quality it is. In fact, even in classical theory, we use additional symbols to specify other aspects of the chord. It's just for some reason the quality of the third of the chord, the major versus minor third, that's the only thing that we really distinguish uppercase versus lowercase for, and it's kind of arbitrary if you think about it. So I prefer the more contemporary style of all uppercase and then just specifying exactly what type of chord it is. Next question. How do you determine what chords are major or minor in other modes besides Ionian? Okay, so I actually had a video that talks about how to build diatonic chords in Ionian, which I will also link in the description. It's called Why Do Chord Progressions Progress? So you can watch that, and I talk about how you build chords out of the scale. And so you can just, even though I'm talking about Ionian in that video, you can apply that same process to any scale. So you're just taking the notes of the scale and you're building chords off of each degree of the scale. Like each different scale degree is the root of a new chord. And you're just stacking diatonic thirds, as many times as you want to kind of build a chord up from each root note. So if you do that with Ionian, you get this certain pattern of chords. Or if you do that with Locrian, you get a different pattern of chords. Or Dorian, you get a different pattern of chords. So that's, it works the same way as in major. The other way of thinking about it would be if you know the chords that are in Ionian, in major, you can actually take those same chords and just permutate the pattern by however many degrees you want to get the chords of any of the relative modes of that scale. So let's take an example. So like Dorian, let's say we're in C Ionian, and we're talking about the notes in D, the chords in D Dorian. So C Ionian and D Dorian are relative modes, meaning they have the exact same notes in them, which means they actually have the exact same chords in them. It's just we're changing how we frame the chords in terms of like which chord is the one chord, which chord is the two chord. So let's just take the first 3 chords, for example. So in C Ionian, we'd have C major, then we'd have D minor, then we'd have E minor. Well, in D Dorian, we have those same chords, but now instead of C being 1, we have D minor being 1. So we're just kind of shifting everything over 1. So now our 1 is D minor, and our 2 is E minor. and our 3 would be F major, or flat 3, because it would be the minor third up from the tonic now. So you can just kind of shift the pattern like that, and you can get the chords. If you memorize the chords in Ionian, you actually have the chords memorized for all the relative modes too. You just have to change where one is. Next question. How do you make a guitar sound like a violin on Come Hell or High Water? So Come Hell or High Water is another song by my band Native Construct. You're talking about this part. Yeah, that's a guitar. Surprisingly, I've gotten this question a lot. A lot of people say it sounds like a violin. It was weird because it doesn't sound like a violin to me at all, and we weren't trying to make it sound like a violin, but that's cool. It doesn't really matter as long as it sounds good. So what we did was we just tracked a regular distorted guitar, just like a normal lead guitar distortion tone, and then we pitch shifted up an octave, and then we blended that in with the original. So it's actually, you hear the low octave and the high octave. And then we used a plugin called Mutator Evo to mess with the formant a lot. So it really changes the tone of the instrument when you tweak the formant. And then we also added in some pitch-tracked ring modulation, which is really easy to do in that plugin. And yeah, it comes out sounding pretty weird. I guess it sounds like a violin. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Also, check out my Patreon page. The purpose of this channel is to offer free music education to the world, and your contributions make that possible.